Okay, we're up to Daf Chesam Aleph, the very top of the Amud. Amr of Zera, Amr Shmuel. Liben Sakin V'Shacharba. If a person takes a knife and makes it very, very hot, he puts it in the fire until it's like very, very red hot, and he shechs an animal with it, it's kosher. What's the chiddush? The chiddush is like this. To shecht an animal, the only way that you're allowed to cut the esophagus and the trachea for it to be kosher is if you're using the sharpness of the knife. If, let's say, you burn open this esophagus and the trachea, it's puzzle, because that makes a hole. It's not kosher. The chiddush of this is that when you have a hot knife, we look at the sharpness happening first. The heat comes later. By the time the heat comes, the animal's already dead. So therefore, we don't say that at the same time the esophagus and trachea are being burned open by the heat of the knife. The chedudai, the Gemara's lashon is, chidudai koidim lilivunai. The knife's sharpness precedes its heat. So it's considered being cut open with the sharpness of the knife and not with the heat of the knife. I said, by the way, Rav Zilber, gives a big Daf Yomi shir in Eretz Yisrael, he's a big Talmud Chacham. He once came to Shara Torah and he said an example of Purim Torah. He said, who said this statement? It was Zera. He says the reason why he knows this is because the famous Gemara Megillah that Rava on Purim shechted Rav Zera, he says it was a hot knife. And he said he felt the sharpness before he says the Purim Torah. Anyway, Bekitzer, so the point is you're allowed to, if you shecht it, it's kosher. Why? Because the sharpness comes first. So says the Gemara, ha'ikat stadin, but what about the sides of it?
Because it opens up.
We'll get to that in a second. So how about the sides of it? Meaning, the sharpness comes first, but the sides of the knife are super hot. So as it's cutting, isn't it burning the esophagus and trachea on its sides? Meaning, if it was just sharp, that's one thing. The sharpness comes first. I get it. But the sides of the knife are super, super hot. So why aren't they burning the esophagus and trachea as they open? And if any of the esophagus and trachea are burnt, it's a problem. So the Gemara explains that it's not just that it's done. The mitzias of the esophagus and trachea is that the second you do the incision, it pops open. Meaning, if it was tight, right? If it was like this material, it would have to be like you'd have to power through so that at some point, if it was a rubbery like this material, if you had a knife and you would cut it through, the sides of the knife would still be touching the esophagus and trachea and they will be burning as it goes. That's not the Messias. Think of it like as a balloon, where the second it opens, it pops open. So the sharpness of the knife pops it open, and the esophagus and trachea are never touching the sides of the knife. The sides of the knife are just going through flesh because those tubes are already popped open.
What is the issue going to go just generally?
Because if there's any opening or any burn or any incision that is done not through the sharpness of the knife, it creates a psul. So the concern of the heat is that if it boils it open or burns it open, then it's not considered shechted.
So the answer of the Gemara is that it spreads after.
Correct. It could start in.
I'm saying something else. I'm saying it does, even if it didn't spread.
Because if it's not fully dead yet, no, because if the animal's not fully shechted yet, and the sides are burning it open, then it's parsha the shechita was done improperly.
But once you cut the
not until it's dead. Not until the roiv, not dead. It has to be roiv of the simanim are cut. If it's tight and as you're doing it, then the burning is happening before roiv of the simanim are cut. The answer is no. It pops open. So the second you do it, it pops open before the sides of the knife get to it. Says the Gemara, Beis Hashchita mirvach rovach. The incision spreads apart. Here's the shaila. The shaila is like this. Let me just explain outside the rest of this Amud, mamash the two dots. It's not complicated. It's like this. We had if you followed carefully in Shnai Mikra through Tazria Mitzaira, there are two different types of tsaras. You don't have to know any of the halachas. You just have to know that they exist. There's called shchin and michva. They basically mean a tsaras, a spot of a tsaras on a michva is on a burn. So, if someone burns themselves on the fire, burns themselves, and then they have a tsaras on that spot, it has certain halachas. There's also called a tsaras of a shchin, which is instead of a burn from fire, it could be in any infection. Now, that could be, infections are considered hot, but it's not hot from the fire. So let's say someone hits you with a hammer, okay? And then you get a bruise, and then the bruise gets infected. And then you have tsaras on that's called shchin. Shchin and michva. One is through a fire, and one is through inflammation, infection, a blow, whatever you want to describe it as, but non-fire. Correct, but the main nakuda is fire as opposed to non-fire. Now here's the shaila. The shaila is, says the Gemara, Bailuhu, liben shvud v'hikaboy. I take a hot metal, I heat it up, and then I hit someone. I hit Reuven with it. So Reuven gets hit with hot metal, so at the same time he's getting burned, he's also getting hit, and then saras pops up. Here's the shaila. What category of saras is it? Is it saras of the fire, or is it saras of the of the blow, of the hit? Meaning, in other words, which one comes last? As we're going to see in the laws of saras, if I have both saras at the same time, I always go with the last one. So do we say the fire comes first and then the inflammation, meaning then the hit comes first? So it would be, then it's considered a saras of a hit. Or if you say, no, the hit comes first, then the heat comes later, then it's saras of the fire.
Again, you have a pole or something that's burning hot.
And I hit you with it.
You hit with it, right?
The question is, which one comes first? The fire comes first and then the pain? Or the pain comes and then the blow? Or the blow comes first and the fire? We might just have the same case with the knife, by the way. You heated up a knife and then you cut it. Which one comes first? The incision or the heat? So it's the same shaila, but regarding saras. So which category of saras is it? So let me just say this outside. It's the Gemara's akasha. What's the difference? They both have the same halachas. The saras of shchin and saras of mikvah are the exact same halachas. Zero difference. Here's, I'll tell you the nafkamina. There's a size of a tsaras, it's called a gris. That's the minimum size of a tsaras. The halacha is, tsaras of mikvah and tsaras of shchin are not mitzdarif. So I'll tell you the case. The case is where I have a half of a gris of a shchin from previous. Then you hit me right next to it. And with a hot spit, whatever. And then I develop a spot right next to it. Can they be mitzdarif together? If that's why it's negay, you have to know what category to put it into. In other words, and the shaila of the category is which one comes first. Does the hit comes first and then the heat, or the heat comes first and then the hit? Says the Gemara, and what category of tsaras is it? So the Gemara says, who cares? The exact same halachas. The Gedetani, I'll tell you why it's negay. It's negay shchin u'michva mitamin b'shvua echa b'shnei simanim. It's telling you the halachas that a shchin and a michva, you only need 1 week of isolation, and then after the week they decide. It's not 2 weeks like other tsaras, it's 1 week. And the halacha is b'seir lavan u'b'pisyon. The way after the 1 week that you're in isolation, they check. If there's white hairs, you're tameh. If the tsaras spreads, you're tameh. This is not the point so far. What is the difference between a michvah and a shchin in tsaras world? The only difference is they're not mitzdarif together. So if I have half the shear from one type and half a shear from other type next to each other, they do not combine to create tsaras. That's why it's important to know which category. Now that they have different halachas, but they do not combine together. So says the Gemara. So now the Gemara speaks out the shaila in a very long way, which is, I hit you with the spit and it's hot. And then you had a tsaras. Which category is it? We always go with the second one when it comes to tsaras. So if the hit comes first and then the heat, you're a tsaras of heat. If it's the heat and then the hit, you're a tsaras of hit. That's shchin or michvah. And the Gemara just speaks it out. Utnan, the Mishnah describes these different types of tsaras. I told you the major difference is that a shchin tsaras is through an infection or inflammation, not through direct fire, but a michvah is from a result of a fire. And the Gemara speaks it out. Ezu shchin ve'ezu michvah. Now, what is shchin and what is michvah? So a shchin is non-fire. So, loka 8a-8b, you hit someone with a piece of wood or with a rock and it creates an infection. Or begefes. Begefes is pulpy olive oil, olives. I go to the olives and I slap you with some olives and it creates an infection. Or bechame tveria. Chame tveria is heat, but it's not natural. It's not fire. It's natural geyser. You get burnt by a geyser. So, because in halacha that's not esh. It's not esh. We'll get to it, by the way. Exactly. We'll get to it in the laws of smicha if anyone's following along. Chame tveria is not esh. It's not esh. So then the halacha is ubechol davar shaloi b'machmasar, or any heat that's not derived through fire. And what is that referring to? Aver me'ikaroi. I get lime or natural minerals from the ground. Meaning I'm mining lead in the ground, and apparently you can get lead from the ground that's hot. Apparently when you mine it, it could be hot. I don't know. Someone says maybe it's near a volcano, whatever. And you hit someone with that lead. So again, it's not a fire. It's not zeh shchin. That's all tzarasa shchin because it's not based on fire. Ezu michva, what's a tzarasa fire? So nichva b'gacheles beremetz. You burn someone with a coal or with hot ashes, besid reiseach, with boiling lime, begafis reiseach, or boiling gypsum, ubechol davar b'macham sa'or lasui chamei or water that was boiled on the fire. All of these things, zehu michva. That's called a michva. And by the way, what if I have on one spot a michva and then on top of it a shchin or vice versa? You always go by the second one. If I get both in the same spot, you always go by the second one. Says the Gemara, V'tanya shchin u'michva, im shchin kaidem michva, batal michva is a shchin, v'im michva kaidem l'shchin, batal shchin is a michva. You always go to the second one. So here's our shaila. I took a hot spit. Now, if I just take a piece of metal and I slap you on the arm with it, that's a shchin. If I take it and heat it up in the fire and burn you without force, that's a michva. The question over here is, I hit you with a hot spit, and then you got a tzaras. So the question is, you definitely got burnt, and you got hit. So the question is, which one came first? If the hit came first, and then the burn, you would be a tzaras of burning. Vice versa, it would be a tzaras of hitting. And again, obviously, the reason why the Gemara mentions this is because we just talked about a hot knife. When you're shechting, we also have the sharpness of the knife, and you have the heat. And we said the sharpness came first, not the heat. So maybe for our discussion, you see that heat comes last. That's the point. So says the Gemara says, V'hacha hechidami. So in our case, what is the halacha? You hit someone with a hot spit. Kigoin to have a big chatzi gris shchin meikar. The case is where you have already a half a gris of a shchin. And then v'liben shvur v'hikabai. And then I hit you right next to it, and you develop a half of a gris of tzaras. The question is, do they mitzaref together? I.e., are they in the same category? And the Gemara says, do we say that the blow comes first and then the heat, and therefore it's michva, and michva and shchin are not mitzaref? Or do you say, no, the heat comes first, then the blow comes afterwards. So in this case, it would be considered shchin, and it is mitzaref. So in other words, that's the shaila. Hot metal that gets hit, which one comes first, the heat or the force? So says the Gemara, well, I'll bring a raya. We just talked about this. I have a hot metal knife, and I shecht an animal. We say it's a kosher shchita. Why? Because the incision comes before the heat. You see, heat comes last. So says the Gemara, Tashima de Amr of Zera Mishmuel, Liben Sakim V'Shachab Shchitas Ekshera Chidu de Kadim Livuna Al Mechav de Kadim. You see over here that the heat comes last. So the Gemara says it's not a raya. I'll tell you why. There is a difference between a thin knife and a thick piece of metal. A thin knife, the heat comes last. Because I guess the heat is spread out over the knife, and I guess the incision is the sharpest point, so the incision is going to come first. But when I have like a giant, like a 2x4 of metal, and I hit you with it, I don't know which one comes first. Meaning, in other words, there's a difference between a sharp incision, where the incision comes first and then the heat, to a blunt metal item, where maybe the heat comes first.
Are you saying that the edge of the blade is not as hot as a flint?
I'm not saying that it's not as hot. It could be the incision is more dominant by the sharp part of the blade. My point is, you can't compare what happens by the blade. The sharpness of the blade coming before the heat is not indicative that when I have a thick piece of blunt metal, maybe the heat comes first because it's hitting you. I don't know. That's the Gemara's point. The Gemara says no. Chidud shani. You can't bring a raya from sharpness. When the metal is sharp, it's a different discussion. We're talking about blunt metal. So the Gemara says, okay, tashema. I'll give you another raya. Liban shvud v'hikaboy. I heat up a spit and I hit you. Nida mishumich v'zeish. The Brisa says clearly it's michva. So there you go. It's clear as day. This Brisa clearly states that if I heat up a spit and I hit you with it, and then you develop tzaras, you're a tzaras of a michva. Clear as day. So the Gemara says lav dafka. Maybe that case also where it's sharp. Maybe that case also it's not a blunt metal. Maybe that was a spit that was super pointy and I poked you with it. So again, it's lav dafka. The Gemara says, Hasanami, debari mibras, maybe over there you poke the guy with it. You didn't hit him with a blunt spit. You poked him with the edge of the spit. So again, it's lav dafka. Maybe over there you poked him with the spit, not hit him. Because if it's poke, therefore we always say that the heat comes last when it's very sharp. Maybe over there it was sharp. Okay, new topic. Here until the end of the daf, I happen to enjoy this very much because this is like laws of kashrus, which I'm more comfortable with. The only thing is that it might be challenging throughout Maseches Chullin, is that anytime you're dealing with Daf Yomi, where it's concepts you're familiar with day to day, when the Gemara is saying things that are not, that we don't necessarily paskin like, you have to sort of remind yourself that what we're dealing with the Shulchan Aruch thousands of years later. So you have to go the Gemara sort of with a little bit more of an open mind. So Omer of Nachman, Omer Rabbi Avua, Sakin Shalavidis Kechavim. I have a knife that was used for Avodah Zarah. Okay? So I go to a church, and they would use this knife to slaughter sacrifices and to cut up the meat for to the idol, whatever it is. And I use that knife for my personal use. So here's the shaila. So let me just say outside. The Gemara is not concerned with what I think most of us would be concerned about, is that it's a non-kosher knife. They're not worried about that. They're worried about, for whatever reason, we'll deal with that in a moment, they're worried about the fact that it's also b'hana. I have a knife of Avodah Zarah is also b'hana, so I cannot use this knife for personal benefit. Now we're programmed to assume hana is anytime I'm using its benefit. No. The rules of Avodah Zarah hana is, did the knife give me a net positive? So the Gemara says the halacha like this. Mutter lishchaba, you could shecht an animal with that knife. Why? Again, we're not worried about the knife being non-kosher. We'll deal with that later. But what about Avodah Zarah hana? It's fine to shecht an animal. Why? What's more valuable, a live animal or a dead animal? A live animal. I can tell you that for sure. A live cow is thousands of dollars. Dead cow, much less. So if I use this knife, a dead animal is less valuable than a live animal in the market. So if I use this knife, which is asa b'hana, to shecht an animal, it was a net negative. I didn't get benefit from that knife. Because if you think about it, before I used the knife, the animal was worth $5,000. Now after I use the knife, the animal's worth $1,000. It's a net negative. Therefore, you could use the knife to shecht. It's not considered asa b'hana. Of course. Yes. I need to entertain this. Yes, it's pashut. Yes.
Would you be able to say that after you make, let's say you make the big cut and like the animal's dead, but to carve up?
Oh, so we'll get to that. What's up? Says the Gemara of also lachta babasa, but you're not allowed to cut up the meat. Why? Because cutting up the meat, which that improves it. Do I want a giant hunk of meat, or can I, cut up into nice steak? So I'm not allowed to cut it up into pieces because that's considered hana. But to shecht it is not hana because it's a net negative, the actual shechita. So it says the Gemara, but there is.
Both of them aren't really hana. Once it's shechted.
That's not true. No,
you're going to have an eye out of it afterwards, no?
No, but it's not. It's a net negative because at the end of the day, the animal is less valuable after the shechita. Says the Gemara, muter lishchadba. Why are you allowed to shecht with it? Mekalkulhu, because it's a net negative. But you're not allowed to use to cut up the meat because metakinhu, because that improves the product. Once the animal's dead, you'd rather sliced up steak nicely than just a giant, giant hunk of meat. Now, Amar Rava says there is one case where shechting is a problem, where it's a net positive. What's the case? What happens if the animal's dying? It's an older animal, it's shvach. In the market, I can't get anything for it. Nobody's buying this animal. The reason why animals that are alive are more valuable is because you could use it for threshing, you could use it for milk, you could use it for proper things. If you have an animal that's older and it's you take it out to pasture, it's got no value, then adarabba. Dead is more valuable than alive. So it says the Gemara, Amar Rava, Pam sheshaychet aser, b'musukenes, if the animal's dangerously ill, you can eat it, but you can't work it anymore. Then adarab, it's more valuable dead than alive. So then shechting it would be a net positive. But it says the Gemara, mechatech mutter, and there's a case where you're cutting up his mutter, ba'atme de kaimil krabana. When, there is one case where it's where cutting it up is allowed. I'll tell you an example. Okay, your wife is she decides she wants to give a gift, old school, not nowadays. You have to understand old school. She wants to give a gift. The gift that she wants to give to her new in-laws is a giant leg of a cow. Like, ooh, wow, very chashiv. And you showed up and you thought you were being all nice and you made them into little patties. Not good. Then it was a net negative because at the end of the day, I wanted to show off. You're right. The average household, you'd rather the patties because it's easier to cook with. But if you're giving it as a gift, then adarabba, you wanted that display. Okay, here's the Gemara Shaila. Told you. The Gemara Shaila the Gemara says like this. We're talking about using this avodah zarah knife to cut up the meat, whether it's allowed, whether it's not allowed. What about the fact that it's a non-kosher knife? Rashi says, what's the concern? The knife is boleya. the knife is absorbed with non-kosher. And if it's absorbed with a non-kosher, then forget about all avodah zara, hana, stam. It's a non-kosher knife. When you're cutting it, non-kosher is being pumped into the meat. Now, how did the knife absorb non-kosher? So either you have to say practical halacha, absorption is usually through heat. So maybe it was used they cut up a hot steak. Or Rashi actually holds that the force of the knife, even without heat, causes absorption. We don't paskin that way. We paskin only the force of the knife with an onion, but Rashi held that using the force of the knife actually absorbs something. So if you go to Avodah Zarah and they took that knife and they cut up meat, the force put the non-kosher in the knife. So here's the shayla. You're so focused on hana, it's a treif knife. You're like going into McDonald's. What are we talking about? And then that knife is going to be putting that schmutz into your meat. So what are we talking about? It says, why aren't you concerned about fat? Go to the next page. The Gemara says, I'll tell you the case. It's avodah zarah knife that was never used. Meaning the church bought it. So it's also bahana because they bought it with the intention to use it, but they never used it yet. B'chadasha, it's brand new. So therefore, there's no schmutz because it was never used before, but it's also bahana because it was purchased by a church. Says the Gemara, that's not true. Whoa. If a church buys, in the laws of Avodah Zarah, there's many different categories. There's the sacrifice itself, there's the church itself. This is called an accessory to an Avodah Zarah. The rules of accessory of Avodah Zarah is that they're only aser when they're actually used. So the fact that the church bought it with the intention to use it doesn't make it asab hana. So no. You told me it's asab hana, so it can't be brand new. It says the Gemara, chadasha, if it's brand new, is never used. Bein Rabbi Shmuel, bein Rabbi Kiva, both Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Kiva agree. Misham sheva dezarehim. It's accessories of idol worship. Misham sheva dezareh inasur yavdu. And accessories of idol worship are not asab hana merely by purchasing them. So that doesn't work. So the Gemara says, okay. So in other words, what's the case where I'm so focused on asab hana, but I'm not worried about the schmutz of the knife? By the way, you should also know one more thing. One more thing is that in the times of Chazal, they were very concerned with knives specifically, just an added component. It's very hard to clean. There's a lot of schmutz. So we're not worried about the schmutz. We're not worried about the schmutz on the inside of the knife, the schmutz the outside. We're just worried about asab hana. What's the case? If it was used, it's got schmutz. The Gemara says, it's brand new. Brand new is not going to work. The Gemara gives two cases. One is 8a-8b the pasuk like gavzel avodah zarah. One, it was used for avodah zarah, but not for meat. What if that avodah zarah, the process of avodah zarah, is they chop wood for the avodah zarah? So it was used to chop wood. So it's also bahana because it was used for the church, but it's not. There's no schmutz because it wasn't used on a non-kosher animal or a kosher animal. It wasn't used on an animal. It was used to chop wood. Or 8a-8b bishna shaliv nabar, or you kashered it. I'll tell you the case. You bought the knife. You put it in a self-clean oven. You kasher it. There's no more schmutz there. You kasher the knife like for Pesach. But you can't kasher asar b'hana, right? You can't remove asar b'hana by putting it in boiling water. So the case is where you took the knife and you put it into the oven and you kashered it. So there's no schmutz anymore. Now the shaila is remaining is asar b'hana, which cannot be rectified merely by putting in the fire. Itmar hashoiche besakin shaloi v'kechavim. Here's the shaila. I go to a butcher house, a butcher shop, and I take his knife that he's been cutting non-kosher animals, and I want to use it for my kosher animal. In other words, what do I need to do to make this knife kosher? So, Rav Amar Koilif. So Rav, I'm actually like this. The case is not exactly what I said. I go to a butcher shop. I use their knife. Not that I want to. I use their knife. What do I have to do to my animal to kasher it? After the fact. So Rav Amar Koilif, you have to do what's called klipa. Klipa means you have to peel off a little bit of the area of contact. Meaning, you go to the neck of the animal, the incision, and you have to peel the area, the meat, around the incision point. Let me just tell you one quick rule when you're dealing with kashrus. Klipa means that there was a absorption through heat, but only a minimum amount. Meaning, there was a transfer of flavor. Klipa always means that there's heat involved. So there is a transfer of flavor, but a tiny, tiny bit. Klipa is just a peels. So you have to peel the area of the incision. Rabbi Rechana Amar Mediach. Rabbi Rechana says, why do you have to peel it? Just rinse it off. Now let me ask you a question. Which one makes a little more sense? Anytime you're dealing with heat, you'd have to deal with like real, dealing with it, klipa, whatever. Anytime you deal with something cold, there's no transfer of flavor. Just rinse it off. Let me ask you a question. I take a non-kosher knife, yeah? I cut a cucumber. You know what the halacha is? You rinse it off. You rinse it off. It's cold. Everything's cold. Rinse it off. This is a butcher shop. It's not a hot knife. It's a butcher. Shecht. It's cold.
So the question is,
Why would you have to klipa? So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. So the Gemara is trying to explain the machlokes. Perhaps this is the machlokes. Mar savar beis hashchita tzoynein, umar savar beis hashchita resech. Here's the question: how hot is the neck? If the animal's neck is hot enough, then it's considered as if you cooked when you shechted. Meaning, that's a shaila in general. Is the place of incision hot enough to absorb flavor, or not hot enough to absorb flavor? Rav Bar Chana believes that it's cold. If it's cold, just rinse it off. Rav holds, no, it's actually hot. If it's hot, that means that you took the knife and when you shechted your kosher animal, there was heat there. It was as if like a small amount of cooking was happening, so you'd have to peel it. So the machlokes is whether the incision point is considered hot in halacha or cold. Now, by the way, it's whatever. The incision point is 96.8 degrees. That's the cow. I think it's 96.8. Shimon brings that down, and it could be that that's considered yad saledis according to some opinions. Okay, the bahag shita. Anyway, so the machlokes is whether the incision point is hot or cold. So the Gemara says, I don't know. It's sick, yeah. So loy, the Gemara says no. To cool yama beis hashchita resechu. I could actually argue they both agree that the incision point is hot. So wait a minute, if the incision point is hot, then why would Rab Bar Chana say just rinse it off? The one who says you have to peel off a little bit makes sense because there's a small amount of cooking going on, a small amount of heat that Kedei Klipa's worth. But according to the opinion that you just rinse it off, why is rinsing it off enough? L'chora, if it's hot, you should have to do more than this. So the Gemara says this concept which you have in kasher salat, which again not practical halacha, but such a concept that even if there's heat involved, flavors can't do two things at once. They're not good at multitasking. So, because the pipes are pumping out blood as you cut it, they can't absorb. Meaning, even if there's heat when you're cutting it, the blood that's spurting out, blood goes out, it doesn't take flavor in. There's such a concept that when you're dealing with kashrus, sometimes heat can only go it can only do one thing at a time. So, because when you're cutting with the knife, you have a non-kosher knife, and you're cutting the beis hashchita. The beis hashchita is hot, so it should burn a little bit of that incision point. The answer is because the incision point is pumping out so much blood, it doesn't have time to absorb. It can't multitask. Right now, it's pumping out blood. It's not taking in. Such a mistake.
Would the opinion that this is cold, when you go back to that knife that was hot, when the knife itself is hot, and you're cutting, would you say that he would heat up the area of the neck?
No, I don't think so. No. I think it's a separate concept. That's a good point, but I think it's a separate concept. The Gemara says another answer, but some say no. I could argue that they both agree that it's cold. Wait, if it's cold, then why does Rav say you have to do k'tei klipa? He would say that even if the incision point is cold, but the force of the knife would cause a transfer of flavor. Meaning, usually we're accustomed that transfer of flavor is due to heat. But this is not heat-based, but it's based on the force of the knife. Okay. Sakin treifa. Let's say someone used a knife and shechted a treifa animal. So, how do I kasher the knife? So, meaning in other words, I use a knife to shecht the treifa. So the question is, what do I have to do the knife to kasher it? Here, again, it has to do with what we said before. Okay, think about it practically. I have this knife, I shecht the treifa. So what do I got to do to kasher it? So I got two issues for sure. I got number one issue is I got blood on it. I got to clean it for sure because it's got schmutz. It's got blood of a treifa animal. So I definitely have to clean it well. The question is, do I also have to dip in boiling water? Well, we just had a discussion. If the incision point is hot, that means that there was a transfer of flavor into the knife. Then perhaps you'd have to dip it in boiling water. But if the incision point is cold, all you're worried about is schmutz, there's no reason to dip it in boiling water, just clean it. So says the Gemara, it's a machlokes. Pliga Rav Ach v'Ravina. Chadam or B'chamin. One says you have to dip in boiling water. B'chadam b'tzayin, and just rinse it off. The hilchas afil b'tzayin, we pass and just rinsing off is enough. Yika belisa the paris l'michberei and leitzarach. You don't have to rinse it off. By the way, if you have just a good napkin will do it. Oh, so the Gemara says the mandamar b'chamin. My timer, the one who says you have to dip in boiling water, what's his shita based on? Mishun de Gabali Yisura. So here's the shaila. It's a clever shaila. What's the pshat of the opinion that holds that if I shecht a treif, I have to kasher with boiling water? What's the pshat? Because the incision point is hot. and if it was mekabel flavor from a treifa. Here's the question: every shechita knife is hot. Every shechita knife should be a problem. Why? When you cut the animal, you begin the cut. The animal's still alive. It's hot. You tell me the incision point is hot. That means that it's mekabel tam from an aver menachai. Right? Every single time you shech the treifa, it's a problem because the treifa pumps out flavor. Right? The incision point is hot and it pumps out flavor into the knife. So every kosher knife, how is a knife ever kosher? The second you start to shecht, you're cutting a live animal. At that point, there's flavor being pumped out as you're cutting, and you're getting flavor from an Ever Menachai. So the Gemara responds, no, the flavor only happens. The base of shechita is only hot enough to transfer flavor at the end of the shechita. At the end of the shechita, the animal's already dead. So if it's a treif, it's a problem. If it's a kosher animal, it's fine. Says the Gemara, the answer is emas bala. When does the knife begin to absorb? Lechichaima, when the area gets hot. Emas kachaima, when is that? Lechigamra shchita, when the shchita is over. At that point, the animal's already dead and it's kosher. It's not an ev menachai. Okay, just to finish up the daf. Amar Rav Yehuda Marav, hatabach tzarech shleisha sakin. A butcher needs 3 knives. You need 3 knives. Now, why do I need 3 knives? I understand why you need 2, as the Gemara points out. One is to use for shechting. You do not use the shechita knife to cut up steak. We don't do that. Rashi explains the reason why we don't do that is because we're afraid you'll get a nick on it. We do not use the butcher knife to do anything other than kill the animal. So you cannot cut up the meat with the shechita knife. So I need 1 knife is the shechita knife. The second knife that I need is to cut up the meat. So what do I need a 3rd knife for? And one is to cut up the chaylev. Chaylev is the forbidden fats that are found in the animal. You can't use the same knife for that because if you use the same knife for that, the chaylev is gonna coat the knife. So you need a special knife to cut the chaylev. Okay, because again, if you cut the chaylev, then the chaylev covers the knife. You can't use it for
Why can't you wipe it off?
We don't trust you to wipe it off well. It's hard. I told you, it's hard to clean knives. So you had a special knife just for the chaylev. Because if you cut the chaylev first, and then you cut the meat, it's a problem.
If it's hard to clean knives, why is it before the sin is okay just to rinse it?
It's not something we would do regularly. It's possible. It's not something regular. So says the Gemara, I don't understand. Why can't I have 2 knives? One for the slaughtering of the animal, and one I'll make sure that I'll cut the meat up first and then cut the chaylev. Meaning I'll just it's only a problem if you cut the chaylev first. I'll make sure to cut at the end. Says the Gemara, we don't trust you. A gezerah, you might come to cut the chaylev first. So says the Gemara, well, hashanami michal chalav. Well, if you're concerned that I'm going to make a mistake, then even with the 2 knives, what if I swap the knives? What if I use the chaylev knife for the regular meat and the regular meat for the chaylev knife? So the Gemara says, because you're required to have 2 knives, hopefully that will remind you not to make a mistake. A butcher needs 2 separate vessels of water. One is where he washes the meat, one is where he washes the fats. Because if he uses the same bucket for the fats and for the meat, then the fat is going to give off some oils and it's going to coat the meat, so you have to have a special bucket, one for meat and one for fat. Says the same Gemara. Why can't I just use 1 bucket and I'll make sure to wash the meat and then wash the fats? So says the Gemara, because we're afraid you'll reverse the order accidentally. But wait a minute, maybe you'll confuse the 2 basins and use the fat basin for the meat basin and vice versa. The answer is because you need 2 buckets, that itself is enough to remind you to not make a mistake. Just to finish up, basically like this, if you have the kidneys, right? The flank of the kidneys has fat on it. So when you cut up the meat, there's fat on top. But you can actually watch it online. There's a video of Rav Mahbud. You know, Rav Mahbud is a big kashrus in Eretz Yisrael. Rav Mahbud, everyone talks about Rav Mahbud. Rav Mahbud is a person. He's not just a kashrus. He's a Rav. He's a Taimani Rav in Bnei Brak. He's a big paisik. And there's a video on YouTube you could have of him basically dissecting a lamb. He shechs the lamb and then he cuts it apart. And he shows you where the fats. It's mamish, you could see it. It's like a white fat. So the Gemara warns that when the butcher has the fat with the meat on it, don't leave the fat on top of another piece of steak. Meaning, if you have steak A, don't leave the fat connected to steak B on top of steak A. Why? Because the fat will just drip in from steak B into steak A. Do you understand what I'm saying? So if you have, again, you have a piece of meat, a flank of meat on the table, don't put a chaylev piece on top of it, because the fat will drip in. Okay. Says the Gemara, Ihachi kitritzinami doiv tarba ubal basar. Wait a minute. If you're concerned about that, says the Gemara, then how do you ever, even if there's no two pieces of meat, why am I not concerned about as follows? I take the fat, I put the fat on the table connected to the steak, not on top of a steak, but stam. So why aren't you concerned that the fat will drip out and drip into the steak that it's in? Meaning, and you can't put it on top of each other because it's going to drip into it. But if you're worried about dripping, then stam, every single time you have a piece of steak with chaylev on top, why aren't you concerned about the chaylev dripping in? So what's the answer? The answer is there's a membrane around the chaylev. If you're worried about the chaylev dripping, then every single time you have the flank itself with the chaylev on top, what's to stop the chaylev from dripping in? What's the answer? There's a membrane. Well, if there's a membrane around it, then I could put it on the other steak. Says the Gemara, karma missing metatoi. Ihachi meilo nami karma eka. The answer is aidi di misham sheyad tavcha miftach. The answer is this membrane. The butcher, if he you could pop it. You could puncture the membrane. We're concerned that if he's handling the meat and putting it on top of another meat, he'll pop the membrane. So if it's just one flank of steak with chaylev on top, we're not worried about the membrane being separated or popped. But if you start handling it with the chaylev, putting it on top of another steak and picking it up, your hands might puncture it and then it'll drip in. All right, we'll stop here.